Why does it feel like the more honest you are, the more you lose? Why is it that you give loyalty, time, patience, even pieces of your identity, and still end up alone, overlooked or replaced? And why do people with fewer morals, fewer doubts, and fewer scruples seem to move through life untouched, almost rewarded? This isn't bad luck. And it isn't because you're broken. It's because you were taught a story that was never meant to protect you. From the beginning, you were handed a script. Be good, work hard, stay loyal, keep your head down, don't cause trouble. Trust that effort will be noticed and virtue will be repaid. It sounds noble, it sounds clean, but it's a lullaby. A soft song designed to keep you asleep while the world operates by a different rhythm entirely. The moment you start to feel that quiet ache inside, the sense that something isn't adding up, that's not bitterness. That's awareness knocking. Here's the part no one warns you about. The world is not a courtroom. There is no invisible judge handing out fairness at the end of the trial. The world is closer to a chessboard in a dark room, where most people are moving pieces they don't fully understand. And if you don't know the rules, you don't stay neutral. You become material. You become something other people move. Machiavelli never told people to be evil. That's the lazy interpretation. What he warned against was something far more dangerous: innocence without understanding. He saw that survival doesn't belong to the kindest person in the room. It belongs to the one who knows when to speak and when to disappear, when to soften and when to harden, when to step forward and when to let silence do the cutting. Morality without strategy, in his eyes, wasn't virtue. It was exposure. Think about betrayal for a moment. Not the dramatic kind, but the quiet kind. The kind that happens after you've already given everything. The silence that follows loyalty. The moment you realize the people you stood by don't even look back once you stop being useful. That pain doesn't come from being weak. It comes from believing you were playing the same game as everyone else. You weren't. You were playing by rules that only exist in stories told to obedient people. Fairness, in theory, feels comforting. In reality, it doesn't govern outcomes. Leverage does. Perception does. Timing does. You weren't abandoned because you lacked value. You were abandoned because your value was unprotected. You offered access without conditions. You gave loyalty without leverage. You forgave without consequence. And in a system that runs on advantage, that doesn't make you admirable. It makes you drainable. Picture this. You're carrying water across a desert, pouring it out freely, believing that generosity will summon gratitude. But everyone else is carrying containers, measuring carefully, deciding when to give and when to withhold. You don't lose because you're immoral. You lose because you're unarmed. Kindness without structure is like an open gate in a city with no walls. Eventually, someone walks in who never planned to give anything back. You were trained to stay small, to avoid conflict, to confuse silence with dignity. You learned to swallow discomfort to preserve peace, even as that peace hollowed you out from the inside. You thought restraint was strength, but ask yourself honestly, where has that restraint taken you? How many times did you mute your instincts just to be seen as good, while your spirit absorbed the cost in private? Machiavelli saw something uncomfortable but precise. Nobility without power is just performance. Suffering without strategy is submission disguised as virtue. If you don't learn how to protect yourself, people will keep taking, not always because they're malicious, but because nothing stops them. The system doesn't see intentions. It sees output. It sees compliance. And when you finally break, it replaces you without ceremony. If this feels personal, it's because it's familiar. And if it resonates, it's not because you're defective. It's because you're waking up. Your pain wasn't random. It was patterned. It was the predictable outcome of being good in an environment that rewards something else entirely. And once you see that, everything changes. Awareness is the moment you stop bleeding blindly. It's when you realize you don't need to become cruel to survive, but you do need to become conscious, like a man walking through fog who finally understands why he keeps falling into the same ravine. The terrain didn't change. His vision did. This is where the real shift begins. Not with anger, not with revenge, but with truth. The truth that you were never taught how the world actually works, only how to behave within it. And now that you see the board, you're no longer just a piece. You're becoming a player, a quiet one, a watchful one, the kind who doesn't rush, doesn't beg, and doesn't confuse goodness with helplessness. And here's the question that lingers, whether you like it or not. If your suffering was never personal, only structural, what happens when you stop playing by rules that were designed to keep you predictable? That answer doesn't arrive loudly. It arrives like a door opening in a dark room. And once you step through it, there is no going back. Once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. The lie wasn't that kindness is bad. The lie was that kindness alone is enough. You were told that being polite is power, that humility earns safety, that generosity creates loyalty. But no one explained who defines the rules of the exchange. No one warned you that kindness, when unguarded, becomes a currency others spend without ever intending to repay. Think about how often you've said yes when every instinct in your body was screaming no, not because you wanted to, but because you feared what saying no might cost you. Approval, belonging, stability. You learned early that compliance keeps things smooth, and smooth feels safe, until you realize smoothness is just frictionless erosion. Little by little, it wears you down. Here's the truth most people never articulate. Society doesn't respect the kind. It respects the strategic. It respects the person who knows when to give and when to withdraw, when to open and when to close. Being liked is not the same as being respected, and being respected is not the same as being protected. You can be loved by everyone and still be exploited by all of them. People don't treat you how you deserve. They treat you how you allow. That sentence sounds harsh until you sit with it long enough to feel its weight. Every tolerated disrespect becomes a precedent. Every boundary you fail to enforce becomes an invitation. If you are always available, you become invisible. If you never push back, the push never stops. This doesn't mean you abandon kindness. It means you redefine it. Real kindness has a spine. Real kindness knows where it ends. It gives from surplus, not from self-erasure. There is no virtue in exhaustion. There is no honor in being used. And yet, you are trained to feel guilty the moment you consider pulling back. That guilt isn't moral. It's conditioning. Machiavelli understood that fake morality is one of the most effective prisons ever built. It keeps you apologizing for needs you're allowed to have. It keeps you explaining yourself to people who never intended to understand you. It convinces you that setting boundaries is cruelty, when in reality, boundaries are clarity. And clarity is threatening to anyone who benefits from your confusion. Ask yourself this. How often do you worry about how others will perceive you, instead of questioning why their approval matters so much? That question alone can dismantle years of silent submission. Approval seeking feels like virtue, but it's really fear dressed up as goodness. And fear makes you predictable. Predictability is the soft underbelly of power. When people know exactly how you'll react, when you'll forgive, when you'll explain, when you'll fold, they stop respecting you as a force. You become manageable, easy, safe to push. This is why Machiavelli warned against being too transparent, too consistent, too emotionally available. Not because emotions are wrong, but because visibility is vulnerability. Your emotions are real. They're human. But when they're always on display, they become levers. Your anger can be provoked. Your guilt can be weaponized. Your empathy can be drained. In a game of power, the person who controls their emotions controls the room. The person who loses control hands the advantage away without realizing it. Control doesn't mean suppression. It means direction. Like fire, emotion can warm or destroy depending on where it's contained. When you react instantly, you give your opponents information. When you pause, you create uncertainty. And uncertainty is powerful. Silence, when intentional, is not weakness. It's a blade no one knows how to block. People expect reaction. They expect defense. They expect explanations and emotional spillover. So what happens when you don't give them that? When you observe instead of erupting? When you let situations unfold without rushing to fix or justify? The dynamic shifts. Suddenly it's not you on trial. It's them. This is where fear quietly changes sides. Not dramatic fear, subtle fear. The kind that makes people second-guess how far they can go. They don't know what you're thinking. They don't know what you've noticed. They don't know where your line is anymore. And that unknown forces restraint. The world will mislabel this phase. They'll call you distant, cold, arrogant. Let them. You're not here to be understood. You're here to be effective. Effectiveness requires edge. It requires the ability to sit with discomfort without dissolving into it, to hold silence without filling it, to let your presence speak before your mouth ever opens. History is full of leaders who mastered this, not through noise, but through restraint. They didn't explain every move. They didn't justify every decision. They entered rooms and altered gravity simply by how little they revealed. Emotion is loud. Power whispers. So the next time pain hits, don't broadcast it. Harness it, convert it. Pain is information. It tells you where you're exposed, where you've overgiven, where you've mistaken virtue for surrender. Use it the way a strategist uses reconnaissance, not to wallow, but to recalibrate. You're not becoming cold, you're becoming untouchable. And untouchable doesn't mean unreachable. It means deliberate. It means no longer bleeding for people who wouldn't offer you a drop in return. That isn't cruelty. That's self-respect. And self-respect is where real power begins. Silence is the most misunderstood weapon you possess. You were taught that staying quiet means you've lost, that not defending yourself is weakness, that if you don't explain your intentions, others will define them for you. But Machiavelli understood something that runs against everything you were conditioned to believe. In the world of power, silence is not surrender. It is signal. The loudest person in the room is rarely in control. Loudness is often compensation. It's the sound of someone trying to be seen, trying to matter, trying to force certainty where none exists. The truly dangerous individual doesn't rush to fill space. He lets the space bend around him. He allows others to project, to guess, to reveal themselves while he remains still. Silence makes people uncomfortable because it removes their reference points. When you don't react the way they expect, they start talking more. They explain. They justify. They expose motives they never intended to show. Silence doesn't hide you. It reveals them. And in that reversal, power quietly shifts hands. You don't need to explain your boundaries. The moment you do, you invite negotiation. You don't need to justify your standards. The moment you do, you imply they're optional. And you don't need to vocalize every emotion to prove it exists. Sometimes, the most effective way to protect your inner world is to stop advertising it. Think about how often information has been used against you. The things you shared in good faith that later became leverage. The vulnerabilities you trusted to the wrong people, only to watch them resurface at the worst possible moment. That wasn't bad luck. That was transparency without discretion. In a predatory environment, openness without awareness is self-sabotage. Once people know what angers you, they can provoke you. Once they know what you fear, they can control you. Once they know your limits, they can test them. But when they know nothing, when your reactions are minimal, your words measured, your presence steady, they move carefully. They hesitate. And hesitation is power. This is the genius of controlled silence. When you don't chase, they question their value. When you don't react, they project their insecurity. When you don't explain, they wonder what you know. Silence creates a psychological vacuum, and most people can't stand emptiness. They rush to fill it, often revealing far more than they realize. The king doesn't explain his moves. The general doesn't announce his strategy, and you don't need to narrate your evolution. Power is preserved by what you withhold, not by what you overshare. The less predictable you become, the less controllable you are. But silence alone is not the endgame. It's the doorway. Beyond it lies perception, the invisible architecture of how others experience you. Machiavelli was ruthless about this truth. It is not enough to possess power. You must appear powerful. Because in a world ruled by human judgment, perception becomes reality. People don't follow truth. They follow certainty. They follow confidence. They follow the appearance of control. This is why incompetent individuals often rise faster than capable ones. They understand image. They perform decisiveness. Meanwhile, the honest worker waits, believing effort will speak for itself. It rarely does. Influence is not about being the best. It's about being believed. And belief is shaped, not assumed. This doesn't mean lying, it means framing. Strategic truth. Saying less, but saying it better. Showing less, but showing it stronger. Letting your presence do the heavy lifting instead of your explanations. When you overshare, you shrink your mystique. When everything about you is visible, nothing about you feels significant. Mystery creates weight. It forces others to lean in, to speculate, to treat you with caution instead of familiarity. And familiarity, unchecked, breeds dismissal. Think of perception as armor. When it's built correctly, people hesitate before testing you. Not because they know what you'll do, but because they don't. That uncertainty keeps them respectful. It creates distance without hostility, authority without aggression. People don't treat you how you are. They treat you how they perceive you. And perception, whether you like it or not, is something you are always shaping, either consciously or by default. If you don't define the frame, someone else will. And they will almost always define it in a way that benefits them. This isn't manipulation for ego. It's survival with intelligence. It's refusing to let your life be narrated by people who don't have your best interest in mind. You don't need to deceive. You need to direct. Control the spotlight. Control the silence. Control the frame. Because the moment someone else controls how you're seen, they control how you're treated. And once you understand that, you stop apologizing for being deliberate. You stop confusing invisibility with humility. You stop mistaking exposure for honesty. you begin to move differently, quieter, sharper, more intentional. And in that shift, something fundamental changes. You're no longer reacting to the world as it happens. You're shaping how the world meets you, and that's when the game truly starts. Loyalty is one of the most romanticized illusions you were ever taught to worship. You were told it's sacred, that standing by people no matter what makes you honorable, that consistency proves character. But Machiavelli saw through this with brutal clarity. Loyalty is not built on emotion. It is built on advantage. And the moment advantage disappears, so does allegiance. People are not loyal to sacrifice. They are loyal to benefit. Not because they are evil, but because human behavior follows incentive, not sentiment. You can bleed for someone and still be abandoned the second your usefulness declines. Not because you failed them, but because the transaction ended, and you never realized there was one. Think about how many times you stayed longer than you should have. At a job, in a friendship, in a relationship. You told yourself it was loyalty, but deep down, it was fear. Fear of being replaced. Fear of being irrelevant. Fear that if you walked away, you'd lose everything you built. And in trying to preserve loyalty, you surrendered leverage. Loyalty without leverage is servitude. It's not respected. It's expected. And once something becomes expected, it loses all value. The employee who gives their life to a company is laid off with a single email. The friend who always shows up becomes invisible. The man who never leaves is never chased. Familiarity dulls consequence. Machiavelli would tell you this without apology. Never offer unconditional loyalty. Offer value. Make your presence something that improves outcomes, not something that can be taken for granted. When people need you, not emotionally, but strategically, they stay. When they don't, they leave. That's not betrayal. That's economics. This doesn't mean you become cold. It means you become clear. You stop confusing shared history with shared interest. Just because someone stood beside you once doesn't mean they'll stand behind you when it costs them something. Just because they laughed with you doesn't mean they'll defend you when pressure arrives. Loyalty is temporary alignment, not eternal devotion. And here's the part that hurts the most. People don't betray you for no reason. They betray you when the reason to stay becomes weaker than the reason to leave. So you have two choices. Give them a reason, or give them distance. Begging for loyalty does neither. It only exposes dependence. When you build influence, loyalty becomes a side effect. People stay not because you asked them to, but because leaving you would cost them more than staying. That's not manipulation. That's gravity. That's significance. And significance is something you construct, not something you plead for. If you give too much for free, people forget its worth. If you offer yourself without conditions, they test how far they can go. So the shift is simple but painful. Stop being the one they can guilt. Become the one they can't afford to lose. Not louder, not crueler, just more essential. And if they still betray you, you don't collapse. You don't explain. You don't fight for closure. You vanish. Quietly. Completely. Absence does what arguments never can. Silence becomes consequence. Distance becomes judgment. The moment you stop needing loyalty is the moment you start commanding it. This is where most people freeze. Because stepping into this clarity feels like stepping into isolation. You realize no system is coming to save you. No boss, no institution, no person who promised they'd always be there. And at first, that realization feels like loss. But it isn't. It's freedom. Machiavelli never said life was fair. He said power is built, And building requires responsibility. Responsibility for your boundaries, your positioning, your visibility, your withdrawal. You stop waiting for justice and start designing terms. This is not about revenge, it's about reconstruction, reforging your identity into something unbreakable. You study the rules, not to obey them, but to understand how to bend them. You learn when to stay invisible, when to say less, when to walk away not as defeat, but as dominance. Strength is not always confrontation. Sometimes it's detachment. Sometimes it's being so grounded that chaos can't reach you. The world expects reaction, panic, explanation, chasing approval. So don't give it what it expects. Withdraw your energy from places that drain it. Starve systems that feed on your compliance. While others scramble for validation, you build leverage. You develop skills that can't be ignored. You create value that doesn't beg. You cultivate a presence that speaks before you do. You don't roar. You rise. Quietly, strategically, inevitably. This is not arrogance. It's authorship. It's realizing your life was never meant to be lived by someone else's design. You set standards. You enforce space. You refuse to explain your evolution. The right people adapt. The wrong ones fade. Let them. Machiavelli spoke of the lion and the fox, strength and cunning, force and intelligence. But the one who blends both doesn't just survive, he becomes untouchable, not by discarding morality, but by protecting it with fire. Good intentions without protection are invitations for exploitation. So you protect them. You become generous, but guarded, open, but not exposed. Your softness was never the problem. Your lack of strategy was. And once you correct that, something profound happens. You stop being crushed by the game. You stop playing to be saved. You start playing to shape outcomes. And the world responds not with fairness, but with respect. That's the turning point. At some point, the final illusion has to die. The belief that someone else will make things right for you. That justice will arrive late but certain. That if you endure long enough, life will notice and compensate you for your restraint. This belief is comforting, but it's also paralyzing. Because while you're waiting, the world keeps moving, and it doesn't wait for those who hesitate. Here is the hard truth. No one is coming. Not the system, not the leader, not the person who swore they'd never leave. And once you fully accept that, something strange happens. Fear loosens its grip. You stop living like someone who needs to be rescued. You start living like someone who builds exits instead of begging for mercy. This is what Machiavelli meant when he spoke to survivors, not saints. He wasn't interested in comforting you. He was interested in sharpening you. He understood that the most dangerous prison is hope without agency. The kind of hope that keeps you compliant, patient, obedient, while others write the rules around you. So you stop repeating the cycle. You stop mistaking endurance for virtue. You stop bleeding quietly and calling it character. Instead, you begin to construct something solid, a mind that cannot be easily manipulated, a presence that cannot be easily ignored. Boundaries so clear they're felt before you speak. This isn't about becoming ruthless. It's about becoming responsible for your own power, owning the space you were taught to shrink yourself to fit into, realizing the world never hated your goodness. It profited from your compliance, and compliance, once seen clearly, can never feel noble again. You begin to move with intention. You study human behavior not to despise it, but to understand it. You learn when to engage and when to disappear, when to speak, and when silence will do more damage than any argument. When to walk away, not as surrender, but as strategy. The world expects you to react, to chase validation, to prove your worth. So you do the opposite. You withdraw your energy from places that don't return it. You starve dynamics that rely on your emotional labor. You stop performing goodness and start practicing discernment. You build leverage quietly. Skills, positioning, reputation, presence. You don't announce your growth. You don't explain your transformation. You let outcomes speak. You let absence teach lessons words never could. This is not isolation. This is consolidation. And yes, it will feel uncomfortable. There will be moments of doubt. Moments when the silence feels heavy. When the old version of you, the one addicted to being needed, to being approved of, panics. Let it. That discomfort is withdrawal. You are detoxing from dependence. Clarity replaces chaos. Detachment replaces desperation. You realize strength isn't always visible. Sometimes it looks like calm while others spiral. Sometimes it looks like restraint when provocation is offered. Sometimes it looks like walking away without a speech. Machiavelli never promised peace. He promised awareness. He didn't teach destruction. He taught positioning. He didn't glorify cruelty. He exposed naivety. And once naivety is gone, you don't become heartless. You become precise. Precision changes everything. You stop wasting energy on people who don't deserve it. You stop over-investing where there is no return. You stop confusing history with obligation. And in that clarity, you reclaim something that was quietly taken from you over years, self-command. This is what it means to become untouchable. Not immune to pain, but no longer governed by it. Not isolated, but selective. Not loud, but undeniable. You don't need to be feared by everyone. You need to be respected by those who matter, and irrelevant to those who don't. Your life stops revolving around permission. You stop asking if it's okay to take up space. You stop apologizing for evolution. The people who benefit from your growth will stay. The people who benefited from your obedience will resist. Let them. This isn't the end of your story. It's the first page you write consciously. No more hoping to be chosen. No more bleeding for applause. No more mistaking obedience for virtue. You've seen the lie, and once seen, it loses its power. Now the choice is simple, though not easy. You can return to the old script familiar, painful, predictable, or you can move forward with awareness, one boundary at a time, one quiet decision at a time, one deliberate withdrawal at a time. The world won't save you, but you no longer need it to, because the moment you stop waiting for rescue is the moment you realize you were never powerless, only unarmed. And now you're awake. This is where the shift becomes permanent, not because you force it, but because you can no longer unsee what you've seen. The illusion has collapsed, and with it, the version of you that survived by pleasing, explaining, and enduring in silence. From here on, power stops being something you chase and becomes something you embody. You now understand that strength was never about being louder, harsher, or more ruthless than the world. It was about clarity, about knowing where you end and where others no longer have access, about realizing that every yes you give costs something, and every silence you hold preserves something. You begin to treat your time, your attention, and your energy as sacred resources, not offerings meant to buy acceptance. You stop moving out of fear of rejection, fear of being misunderstood, fear of being left behind. Instead, you move with intention. You choose when to engage and when to withdraw. You let moments pass without reacting, not because you are weak, but because you are disciplined. And discipline changes everything. It turns chaos into information. It turns pain into positioning. You no longer feel the need to announce your growth. The need to explain yourself fades. Your absence speaks more clearly than your defenses ever did. Some people will feel unsettled by this. Others will drift away. That's not loss. That's alignment. What remains is quieter, smaller, and far more real. You are not becoming cold. You are becoming precise. You are not closing your heart. You are protecting it with intelligence. And in doing so, you stop bleeding for environments that were never designed to hold you. This is how power settles into you, not as aggression, but as presence, not as control over others, but as command over yourself. And once you taste that, once you feel what it's like to move through the world unprovoked, unchased, and unbothered, you realize the truth. You were never meant to be saved. You were meant to become solid.